The morning sun rose over the Gulf of Patras on the 7th day of October in the year of our Lord 1571, casting long shadows across the decks of 208 galleys assembled under the banner of the Holy League, their oars resting momentarily in water so calm it seemed the Mediterranean itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The smell of tar and salt mingled with incense from the hundreds of priests who moved among the soldiers, offering final absolutions to men who understood with perfect clarity that before the sun set again, many of them would be dead, their bodies consigned to depths that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since before Rome itself claimed dominion over these waters. Standing at the prow of the Real, the magnificent flagship of Spain, Don Juan of Austria gripped the railing with hands that bore the rings of his royal half-brother King Philip, but none of the certainty that such symbols of power might suggest. For this young man of 24 years carried upon his shoulders a burden that would have crushed lesser men, the weight of Christian Europe's desperate gamble against an empire that had, for more than a century, seemed utterly invincible. The story of how this moment came to be begins not here in these contested waters, but in the sprawling palaces of Constantinople, where Sultan Selim II, called by some the sot for his legendary appetite for wine, forbidden by the faith he ostensibly defended, had inherited from his father Suleiman the Magnificent, an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Crimean steppes to the shores of North Africa. Selim lacked his father's military genius and administrative brilliance, but he possessed something perhaps more dangerous in that particular moment of history. A court filled with ambitious men who understood that the Sultan's weaknesses created opportunities for those bold enough to seize them, and chief among these was Piali Pasha, the Grand Admiral who had whispered in the Sultan's ear that the island of Cyprus, held by Venice, represented not merely a strategic prize but an insult to Ottoman dignity that could no longer be tolerated. The calculation was brutally simple. Venice, once the mighty maritime republic that had dominated Mediterranean commerce, was now a declining power, its arsenal still capable of producing galleys with remarkable speed, but its treasury depleted by decades of expensive neutrality, and its citizen soldiers softened by prosperity and age, making it an ideal target for a sultan who needed a victory to establish his credentials and silence the critics who compared him unfavourably to his illustrious predecessors. When the Ottoman fleet appeared off Cyprus in the summer of 1570, the island's Venetian defenders found themselves facing an armada of such overwhelming force that resistance seemed less an act of courage than of suicide. Yet resist they did, because the men who held the fortresses of Nicosia and Famagusta understood that surrender to the Ottomans, regardless of promises made, often ended in slavery or worse. The siege of Nicosia lasted 45 days, and when the walls finally fell on the 9th of September, the Ottoman soldiers poured through the breaches with a fury born of casualties and frustration, slaughtering 20,000 of the city's inhabitants in an orgy of violence that shocked even those accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of 16th century warfare. The Venetian commander Niccolo Dandolo died fighting in the streets, his body hacked to pieces by janissaries who had no way of knowing or caring that he descended from one of the great families that had given doges to the Republic, for in the democracy of death that is urban warfare, patrician blood flows as readily as that of any common soldier, and the screams of noble women echo no differently than those of peasant girls when the victorious army begins its traditional reward of pillage and rape. Meanwhile, far to the west in the Escorial palace that Philip II was constructing as a monument to Spanish power and Catholic faith, dispatches arrived describing the fall of Nicosia, with details that grew more horrific with each retelling, and the king who ruled an empire upon which the sun never set found himself confronting a truth that no amount of American silver or Castilian pride could alter. The Ottoman Empire represented an existential threat not merely to Spanish interests but to Christian civilization itself. Philip was a man of peculiar contradictions, deeply pious yet willing to use the church as an instrument of state policy, methodical in administration yet subject to fits of indecision at crucial moments, devoted to his duty yet so consumed by details that he sometimes lost sight of larger strategic imperatives, and his relationship with his illegitimate half-brother Don Juan embodied all these tensions, for while he recognized the younger man's military talents and personal charisma, he feared them as well, understanding that history provided ample examples of bastard brothers who had leveraged popular support into challenges to legitimate authority. Nevertheless, circumstances demanded action, and Don Juan represented Spain's best hope for a commander who could unite the fractious coalition that was slowly, painfully, coming together under the banner of the Holy League. The diplomatic manoeuvring that produced this alliance would have tried the patience of Machiavelli himself, for it required reconciling interests that were not merely different, but actively opposed, beginning with the fundamental tension between Spain and Venice, longtime rivals for Mediterranean dominance whose mutual suspicion ran so deep that even the Ottoman threat could not entirely overcome it. Pope Pius V, who had ascended to the throne of St. Peter in 1566, brought to the papacy a Dominican friar's zeal for combating heresy and an almost obsessive conviction that the Counter-Reformation required not merely theological arguments, but military victories, and he saw in the Ottoman advance an opportunity to unite Catholic Europe in a crusade that might recapture the unity of Christendom that had been shattered by Luther's hammer blows in Wittenberg. The Pope's vision, however, crashed against the rocks of political reality with every negotiation, for Spain wanted assurances that any victory would enhance Habsburg power. Venice sought guarantees that it could recover Cyprus and maintain its trading privileges even with Ottoman territories, and the minor Italian states that contributed ships and men each demanded their own concessions and protections, creating a diplomatic tangle that threatened to strangle the enterprise before a single galley left port. What finally forced agreement was not the Pope's spiritual authority, or Spain's military might, but the terrible news that arrived in the spring of 1571. Famagusta, the last Venetian stronghold on Cyprus, had fallen after a siege of nearly a year, and its commander Marcantonio Bragadin had been subjected to tortures that exceeded even the grim standards of the age. Flayed alive in the public square while his captors mocked his suffering, his skin then stuffed with straw and paraded through the streets before being sent to Constantinople as a trophy. The savagery of this act accomplished what months of diplomacy could not, transforming the conflict from a matter of strategic calculation into a struggle that touched the deepest wells of religious and cultural identity, for the torture of Bragadin represented not merely the death of one man, however brave, but a symbolic assault on Christian dignity that demanded response lest the entire edifice of European self-conception crumble under the weight of Ottoman contempt. Venice, which had tried to avoid open warfare through decades of accommodation and tribute, now had no choice but to commit fully to the Holy League, bringing with it the expertise of Arsenalotti, who could construct a fully equipped galley in a single day, and the wealth of a merchant empire that, though diminished, still commanded resources that made Spanish silver seem almost provincial by comparison. The fleet that gathered at Messina in the summer of 1571 represented the largest Christian naval force assembled in more than half a century. A floating city of approximately 75,000 men crowded onto vessels that ranged from massive Venetian galleasses, essentially floating fortresses mounting artillery that could shatter conventional galleys at ranges previously unimaginable, to swift Spanish galleys carrying tercios of infantrymen whose discipline and firepower had made them the most feared soldiers in Europe, to smaller vessels contributed by the Italian states and the Knights of Malta, that remnant of crusading orders whose members had been fighting Muslims since the days of the First Crusade and brought to the enterprise a fanaticism untempered by political calculation. The logistics of maintaining such a force would have been impossible without the infrastructure built up over centuries of Mediterranean warfare, the network of friendly ports and supply depots, the established relationships with merchants who could provide food and gunpowder, the diplomatic protocols that allowed Christian ships to move freely even through waters nominally controlled by Ottoman vassals, all of which represented accumulated capital of experience that proved as valuable as any material advantage. Don Juan moved through this floating city with an energy that belied his youth, settling disputes between Spanish and Venetian captains who could barely speak to each other without trading insults, inspecting cannon and ensuring adequate supplies of the match for the arquebusiers, reviewing the janissaries and corsairs who had been captured in previous engagements, and who now provided intelligence about Ottoman tactics and capabilities, all while maintaining the bearing of a commander who never doubted ultimate victory, even when his private letters to his half-brother revealed anxieties that he dared not show to his subordinates. The Ottoman fleet that the Holy League sought to engage was, in many ways, a mirror image of the Christian force, a coalition of different elements held together by imperial authority, but riven by internal tensions that threaten cohesion at crucial moments. For while the Sultan's own galleys were manned by slave rowers and professional Janissary marines, whose loyalty to Constantinople was absolute, significant portions of the fleet came from North African corsairs, who owed nominal allegiance to the Sublime Porte, but pursued their own agendas of plunder and profit, and from various Mediterranean potentates who contributed ships and men because they feared Ottoman wrath more than they desired Ottoman victory. The commander of this vast armada was Ali Pasha, a man whose career embodied the peculiar meritocracy of the Ottoman system, for he had begun life as a Christian boy taken in the devsham, the child tribute that supplied the Sultan with administrators and warriors whose loyalty was guaranteed by their complete dependence on imperial favour, and had risen through a combination of military skill and political acumen to become Capudan Pasha, admiral of the Ottoman fleet, answerable only to the Sultan himself and commanding resources that made him more powerful than most European monarchs. Ali Pasha understood, as Don Juan did not yet fully appreciate, that naval warfare in the 16th century Mediterranean was ultimately a form of infantry combat that happened to take place on floating platforms, for galleys lacked the artillery to sink each other through gunfire alone, and instead sought to close distance, grapple, and transform the battle into a series of brutal boarding actions where superior numbers and hand-to-hand fighting skill determined outcomes more reliably than any advantage in shipbuilding or seamanship. This tactical reality shaped every aspect of galley design, from the ram that projected from the bow, a vestige of ancient warfare that now served primarily as a boarding platform, to the narrow beam that allowed maximum speed under oars, but made the vessels dangerously unstable in rough seas, to the arrangement of fighting platforms that gave arquebusiers clear fields of fire while protecting rowers who, whether free men or slaves, represented too valuable an investment to expose unnecessarily to enemy shot. The Ottoman galleys differed from their Christian counterparts in details that might seem trivial to landsmen, but that experienced captains recognised as critical. They sat lower in the water, making them faster but more vulnerable to swamping in heavy weather. They carried more archers relative to arquebusiers, reflecting both the enduring excellence of Turkish composite bows and the relative scarcity of gunpowder in Ottoman logistics. They relied more heavily on slave rowers, which provided certain advantages in discipline, but created vulnerabilities if slaves rebelled or lost the strength to maintain combat speeds during the critical phases of engagement. The strategic situation that brought these two fleets together in the Gulf of Patras was shaped by calculations that would have been familiar to Athenian strategists planning operations in these same waters 2,000 years earlier. For the fundamental geography of the Mediterranean had not changed, and the same narrow passages and protected anchorages that Themistocles exploited still dictated where large fleets could safely operate. The Christian fleet had sailed eastward from Messina with the intention of engaging the Ottoman force before it could complete its planned operations in the Adriatic, operations that threatened not merely Venetian possessions, but potentially the Italian coast itself. For if Ottoman galleys established permanent bases on the western shore of the Adriatic, they could raid inland with impunity, carrying off slaves and treasure, while the Christian powers scrambled to respond with armies that moved at walking speed, while the raiders travelled at the pace of wind and current. The Ottomans, having secured Cyprus and savouring their victory, had returned to the Aegean with the intention of wintering their fleet in friendly ports before resuming operations in the spring. But Ali Pasha faced pressure from Constantinople to engage the Christian fleet if opportunity arose. For the Sultan's advisers believed, not without reason, that a decisive Ottoman victory at sea would shatter the Holy League as surely as victory at Mohacs had ended Hungarian independence, and that the psychological impact of such a defeat would force the Christian powers into accepting a new order in the Mediterranean that acknowledged Ottoman supremacy. When scouts brought word that the Christian fleet had been sighted off the coast of Cephalonia, Ali Pasha faced a decision that would determine not merely his own fate, but potentially the trajectory of empires. For he could retreat into the Gulf of Patras and force the Christians to assault a prepared position, or he could meet them in open water where superior Ottoman numbers might prove decisive, despite the tactical advantages that the Venetian galleasses provided. His captains were divided, with some arguing that the Christians would never dare attack if given time to contemplate the odds, while others insisted that the only way to achieve the decisive victory that the Sultan demanded was to engage while the enemy's coalition was still fragile, and before autumn, storms made large-scale naval operations impossible. Ali Pasha chose aggression, perhaps influenced by the success that Ottoman arms had enjoyed for more than a century, perhaps unable to contemplate retreat before an enemy he had been taught to despise as effete and divided, perhaps simply because he was a warrior who had risen to supreme command through victory and could not imagine beginning his tenure with withdrawal, whatever the strategic merits might have been. The night before the battle, the Christians held religious ceremonies on their ships that reflected the martial piety characteristic of the Counter-Reformation, a piety that saw no contradiction between prayers for mercy and preparations for slaughter, that blessed arquebuses and sharpened swords with equal solemnity, that promised salvation to those who died killing infidels, while threatening damnation to those who fled regardless of circumstances. Don Juan moved among the fleet in a small boat, showing himself to the men and offering encouragement that mixed appeals to religious duty with promises of plunder, for he understood that while the nobility might fight for honour and the clergy for faith, common soldiers required more tangible incentives, and the wealth accumulated in Ottoman galleys represented prizes that could transform a peasant conscript into a man of property if he survived the day's butchery. The Venetian captains, products of a mercantile culture that understood cost-benefit analysis, with a clarity that made Spanish grandees uncomfortable, calculated odds with the same precision they applied to trading ventures, recognizing that defeat would mean not merely death, but the extinction of their republic as an independent power, while victory might restore the prosperity and prestige that had eroded over decades of Ottoman pressure and changing trade routes. Among the common soldiers and sailors crowded onto the galleys, the mood was more complex than the simple categories of courage and cowardice that officers used to describe battlefield behaviour. For these men understood with the wisdom born of experience that what they faced in the morning was not glorious combat between champions, but industrial-scale killing, in which individual skill mattered less than position in the line, and the steadiness of the men on either side. The Spanish tercios carried their reputation as the finest infantry in Europe, with a pride that bordered on arrogance, yet even veterans of Flanders and Italy felt anxiety about naval combat, where their superior discipline and firepower might count for nothing if their galley sank or turned, leaving them to drown in armour that protected against swords but became a death sentence in water. The Venetian sailors, many of them pressed into service from merchant vessels or the arsenal's workshops, brought technical expertise that the Spanish lacked, but sometimes lacked the combat experience that distinguished professional soldiers from armed civilians, creating a complementary relationship that worked when captains managed it skillfully but collapsed into mutual recrimination when things went wrong. The galleys themselves represented the culmination of centuries of Mediterranean shipbuilding tradition, vessels that sacrificed almost every characteristic that made ships useful for commerce or exploration in favour of the single purpose of fighting similar vessels in relatively calm waters, and this extreme specialisation made them simultaneously magnificent and limited, perfectly adapted to their environment, yet vulnerable to any change in conditions or tactical assumptions. The rowers who provided propulsion, whether free men earning wages or slaves purchased in markets from Algiers to Alexandria, occupied a world that existed in proximity to but fundamentally separate from that of the fighting men above them, their entire universe reduced to the rhythm of the oar and the commands of the rowing master, whose whip enforced discipline more reliably than any appeal to loyalty or courage. These men, perhaps 25,000 of them in the Christian fleet alone, represented an investment of capital and training that commanders sought to preserve even as they exposed the soldiers to maximum danger, creating a peculiar hierarchy of value in which the expendability of an individual life correlated inversely with the specialized skills or expensive equipment associated with that life. As dawn broke on October the 7th, the two fleets sighted each other across water, whose calm surface gave no hint of the violence that would soon transform it into a scene from apocalyptic visions, and the carefully prepared battle plans that commanders had elaborated in councils of war began their inevitable collision with reality. That unpredictable realm where human error, mechanical failure, and sheer chance determine outcomes as surely as superior strategy or more numerous forces. The Venetian galleasses, positioned in front of the Christian line, represented an innovation that Ottoman commanders had not adequately prepared for. Floating fortresses whose heavy cannon could engage at ranges where conventional galleys could not effectively respond, and when these massive vessels opened fire, the sound itself seemed to announce a new era in naval warfare, one in which gunpowder rather than muscle power would increasingly determine outcomes. The Ottoman galleys pressed forward despite losses, driven by the momentum of tradition and the conviction that close combat would negate Christian advantages, and as the distance closed, the air filled with a different kind of sound, the whisper rush of arrows launched by Turkish composite bows, whose rate of fire exceeded that of arquebuses, even if their penetrating power against armour was inferior. The centre of the Christian line, where Don Juan positioned himself in the Real, met the Ottoman centre commanded by Ali Pasha in the Sultana, and within minutes the battle devolved into exactly the kind of close-quarters infantry combat that both commanders had anticipated, galleys locking together in a floating battlefield where the distinction between ships ceased to matter, and what remained was the purely terrestrial struggle of men trying to kill each other with edged weapons and close-range firearms. The Spanish tercios poured onto the Ottoman vessels with a discipline that years of Italian and Flemish warfare had perfected, their formations holding even on the unstable footing of blood-slick decks, their arquebusiers firing in rotation to maintain continuous volleys that cut down janissaries whose courage could not compensate for the mechanical advantage of superior firepower. Yet the Ottomans fought with equal determination, drawing on their own traditions of military excellence and the knowledge that defeat would likely mean death or enslavement, and for hours the outcome remained uncertain, victory swaying back and forth with each successful boarding or counterattack. The two flagships locked together in a private duel that embodied the larger struggle between empires and faiths. On the Christian left flank, the Venetian commander Agostino Barbarigo faced Mehmed Sirocco, governor of Alexandria and commander of the Ottoman right, and the fighting here quickly turned desperate as Sirocco attempted to exploit his shallow draft galley's ability to operate close to shore, seeking to outflank the Christian line and attack from the rear in a manoeuvre that, if successful, would have turned the entire battle into a massacre. Barbarigo's galleys struggled to maintain position against this threat, fighting not only the Ottoman ships but also the coastal geography that favoured his opponent, and in the confused melee Barbarigo himself fell with an arrow in his eye, a wound that would kill him days later but from which he did not immediately retire, instead continuing to direct his squadron's movements while blood streamed down his face, an act of courage that inspired his men even as it demonstrated the terrible price that command extracted from those who took their responsibilities seriously. The Venetian line bent under pressure but did not break, held together by the professionalism of crews who had spent their lives in these waters and by the gradual attrition of Ottoman numbers as Sirocco's aggressive tactics, while initially successful, exposed his galleys to concentrated fire from multiple Christian vessels that could support each other while his own ships became isolated and overwhelmed. The right flank of the Christian fleet, commanded by the Genoese Admiral Gianandrea Doria, developed into the most controversial sector of the battle, for Doria maintained a more conservative position than some of his colleagues thought appropriate, declining to pursue Ottoman ships that seemed to be retreating and thereby creating a gap in the Christian line that threatened to allow Ottoman galleys to escape or even to attack the Christian rear. Later accusations of cowardice or even treachery would swirl around Doria's conduct, though more careful analysis suggests he was trying to prevent exactly the kind of outflanking manoeuvre that Sirocco attempted on the opposite side of the battlefield, and that his caution, while perhaps excessive, reflected the reasonable fear that the entire Christian fleet could be compromised by an overly aggressive pursuit that broke formation and created opportunities for Ottoman counterattack. The reality was that naval battles of this scale generated confusion that made coherent command nearly impossible once engagement began, with smoke from cannon and arquebuses reducing visibility, the noise making verbal orders inaudible beyond a few yards, and the sheer chaos of thousands of men fighting and dying in a relatively small area overwhelming the capacity of any commander, however skilled, to maintain clear understanding of the tactical situation. What ultimately tipped the balance in the centre, where the outcome of the entire battle would be decided, was not any single brilliant tactical stroke, but rather the cumulative effect of superior Christian firepower and the crisis that Ottoman slave rowers created when they realised that Christian victory might mean their liberation. For as the fighting dragged on, and the Spanish tercios gradually pushed back the janissaries through sheer weight of disciplined volleys, some of the chained rowers began actively sabotaging Ottoman efforts, interfering with their own side's attempts to manoeuvre or even attacking their overseers when opportunity arose. This development, which Ottoman commanders had always feared but had never found a solution for given their dependence on slave labour, created cascading failures as galleys lost the ability to respond to commands or support their own boarding parties, and within the space of perhaps 30 minutes, what had been a closely contested struggle transformed into a rout as Ottoman crews recognised that defeat was inevitable and began thinking about survival rather than victory. Ali Pasha fought to the end with a courage that even his enemies acknowledged, defending the Sultana until Spanish soldiers overwhelmed his guards and killed him, afterwards severing his head and presenting it to Don Juan in a gesture that mixed medieval barbarism with Renaissance grandeur. The young commander accepting this grisly trophy with an expression that witnesses could not read, perhaps satisfaction at victory, perhaps revulsion at its methods, perhaps simple exhaustion from the day's butchery. As Ottoman resistance collapsed, the battle entered its final and in many ways most shameful phase, for the victorious Christians, having endured hours of combat and having seen their comrades killed and maimed, demanded their traditional reward of plunder and revenge, and the Ottoman galleys that struck their colours or tried to flee became targets for a fury that was only partially about military necessity and substantially about the rage that accumulates in men forced to kill or watch their friends die. The thousands of Christian galley slaves who had been rowing Ottoman vessels represented a particular focus of liberation efforts, for their freedom served both propaganda purposes, demonstrating Christian mercy in contrast to Ottoman slavery, and practical ones, since experienced rowers were valuable commodities regardless of their original religion or nationality. And many of these men, after being freed from Ottoman chains, found themselves impressed into Christian service under only marginally better conditions, discovering that liberation was a more complex concept than they had imagined during their captivity. Among those freed was Miguel de Cervantes, a young Spanish soldier who had fought in the Real, and whose left hand had been maimed by arquebus fire, an injury that would shape his life in ways he could not yet imagine, leading eventually to captivity in Algiers and experiences that would inform the greatest work of Spanish literature, though on this day he was simply one more wounded man trying to understand how he had survived when so many had not. The casualty figures that emerged in the days and weeks following the battle revealed the true scale of the slaughter, with Ottoman losses estimated at between 25 and 30,000 men killed or captured, approximately 200 ships taken or destroyed, and countless wounded who died later from infections or simply from the trauma of injuries that 16th century medicine could not adequately treat. Christian losses, while substantial at around 8,000 killed and perhaps twice that number wounded, were light by comparison, and the disparity reflected both the tactical advantages that the galleasses and superior arquebuses provided, and the simple fact that victors tend to suffer fewer casualties in the final phases of battle, when defeated enemies are trying to escape rather than fighting back. Yet these numbers, dramatic as they are, capture only the most visible consequences of Lepanto, for the battle's impact resonated through the entire Mediterranean world and beyond, affecting calculations in courts and counting houses from London to Cairo, forcing reconsideration of assumptions that had structured international relations for generations, and providing material for propaganda campaigns that would shape European self-conception for centuries. In Constantinople, news of the disaster arrived with merchants who had witnessed the aftermath, and the initial reaction was disbelief that the invincible Ottoman navy, which had terrorized Christian shipping for decades and had seemed to grow stronger with each passing year, could have been so thoroughly defeated. But disbelief gave way to frantic activity as Sultan Selim and his advisors recognized that the loss of ships and experienced crews threatened Ottoman naval supremacy and potentially exposed the empire to counterattacks that could reverse recent conquests. The response demonstrated both the Ottoman system's remarkable resilience and the resources that the largest empire in the Mediterranean world could mobilize when survival seemed at stake. For within months the arsenal at Constantinople was producing new galleys at a rate that alarmed Christian observers, and while these vessels were often built from green timber that would prove less durable than properly seasoned wood, and while the experienced crews could not be replaced as quickly as the ships themselves, the mere fact that the Ottomans could replace such devastating losses demonstrated that Lepanto, while undoubtedly a significant defeat, had not broken Ottoman power as thoroughly as Christian propagandists claimed. The Holy League, having achieved the victory that had seemed impossible just months earlier, immediately discovered that success created its own problems. For the coalition that had united against the Ottoman threat now had to decide what to do with its victory, and the divergent interests that had complicated the League's formation now threatened to tear it apart. Spain wanted to use the momentum to attack Ottoman possessions in North Africa, particularly Tunis and Algiers, which served as bases for the corsairs who raided Spanish shipping and coastal towns. But Venice, which had borne the brunt of Ottoman aggression and had lost Cyprus despite Christian victory at Lepanto, desperately wanted to negotiate a settlement that would restore at least some of its commercial privileges and end the ruinously expensive state of war. Pope Pius, who had been the League's spiritual architect and chief cheerleader, died in May 1572, less than 8 months after the Great Victory, and his successor Gregory XIII, while no less committed to combating the Ottomans in principle, proved less able or willing to force Spain and Venice to subordinate their particular interest to the general Christian cause. The strategic follow-up to Lepanto revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of naval power in the 16th century, for while the Christian fleet could control the seas and could launch raids against Ottoman coastal positions, converting naval superiority into territorial conquest required armies and siege trains, and most critically, the sustained political will to maintain expensive military operations year after year without the immediate rewards that plunder-driven warfare sometimes provided. Don Juan led expeditions against Tunis and other North African targets, achieving tactical successes that added luster to his personal reputation, but failing to achieve the kind of decisive strategic breakthrough that would permanently alter the balance of power, and increasingly his relationship with his half-brother Philip deteriorated as the king became convinced that Don Juan's ambitions extended beyond military command to political power, perhaps even to claiming a kingdom of his own carved from Ottoman territories. These suspicions were not entirely unfounded, for Don Juan did harbour dreams of glory that went beyond serving as his brother's instrument, and he allowed himself to be drawn into schemes involving the crown of Albania, or even of displacing Elizabeth in England, schemes that came to nothing but that poisoned his relationship with Philip and ensured that he never received the full support his military operations required. Venice, facing financial exhaustion, and increasingly isolated within a Holy League that seemed more interested in Spanish objectives than Venetian recovery, opened secret negotiations with Constantinople that culminated in a separate peace in March 1573, a peace that required Venice to abandon claims to Cyprus, to pay a substantial indemnity, and to accept commercial terms less favourable than those that had prevailed before the war, essentially acknowledging defeat despite having been on the winning side at Lepanto. This betrayal, as Spanish and papal observers characterized it, demonstrated the limits of religious solidarity when confronted with economic necessity and political reality, for the Venetian Republic, unlike Spain with its American silver or the papacy with its spiritual authority, depended on trade for survival, and trade required peace, or at least predictable conditions, not the endless warfare that the Counter-Reformation seemed to demand. The Venetian decision effectively ended the Holy League as a meaningful military coalition, though it continued to exist on paper for several more years, and it forced a recognition that the Mediterranean world would continue to be contested space, rather than Christian lake, that Ottoman power, while checked, had not been broken, and that the dream of rolling back Islamic conquests in a new crusade was precisely that. A dream unsupported by the material and political realities of late 16th century Europe. The longer-term consequences of Lepanto emerge more clearly when viewed through the perspective of decades rather than months, for while the battle did not immediately transform the strategic situation, it did mark the high water mark of Ottoman naval expansion, and the beginning of a subtle shift in the psychological balance between Christian and Muslim powers in the Mediterranean, a shift that would become more pronounced as the 17th century progressed and new powers entered the contest. The battle demonstrated that Ottoman forces were not invincible, that Christian powers could cooperate when sufficiently threatened, and that European advantages in firearms technology and tactical organisation could overcome the numerical and organisational strengths that the Ottoman system provided. All lessons that would inform future conflicts and gradually erode the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Ottoman arms since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Yet the Ottomans also learned from defeat, adapting their tactics and improving their own firearms to reduce the advantage that Spanish tercios had enjoyed, and for another century the Ottoman Empire remained the most powerful state in the eastern Mediterranean, capable of threatening Vienna and of maintaining pressure on European frontiers that required constant vigilance and substantial military resources to contain. The cultural and religious significance of Lepanto transcended its immediate military consequences, for the battle became embedded in European consciousness as a moment when Christian civilization had united to repel the Islamic threat, a narrative that simplified the complex political and economic motivations that had actually driven the conflict, but that served important psychological and ideological purposes in an era when religion provided the primary framework for understanding international relations and when the Protestant Reformation had shattered Christian unity in Western Europe. The celebration of Lepanto in art and literature, from Titian's paintings to Cervantes' plays to countless poems and histories, created a mythology that emphasized divine intervention and Christian virtue while downplaying the role of Venetian maritime expertise and Spanish military professionalism, transforming a hard-fought naval battle into a morality play that justified counter-Reformation militancy and reinforced the identification of European civilization with Catholic Christianity. This mythologization had real political consequences, for it helped sustain support for anti-Ottoman policies, even when immediate threats receded, and it provided a template for understanding later conflicts that had little to do with the specific circumstances of 1571. The technological lessons of Lepanto influenced naval development throughout Europe, accelerating the transition from oared galleys to sailing warships that had been underway since the beginning of the 16th century, but that Lepanto demonstrated had practical military applications beyond the Atlantic voyages that had been their primary proving ground. The success of the Venetian galleasses showed that heavy artillery mounted on stable platforms could dominate naval combat in ways that the relatively light cannon carried by conventional galleys could not match, and while galleasses themselves proved too expensive and specialized for widespread adoption, the principle of overwhelming firepower would shape the development of sailing warships that increasingly replaced galleys in Atlantic and northern European waters. The Mediterranean remained galley country for another century, its relatively calm summers and the proximity of coasts making oared vessels practical. But the future belonged to ships that could operate in any weather and that mounted sufficient artillery to sink enemies rather than merely board them, and Lepanto's demonstration of firepower's importance accelerated this transition even in traditional galley waters. Among the individuals whose lives were shaped by Lepanto, Don Juan of Austria occupies the most tragic position, for he achieved at 24 the kind of military glory that most commanders never attain, yet he spent the remaining 6 years of his life trying to recapture that moment of triumph, accepting increasingly desperate assignments that his half-brother Philip used to keep him occupied, and far from Spain, dying finally in the Netherlands in 1578 of typhus contracted while trying to suppress the Dutch revolt, his dreams of a kingdom unfulfilled, and his relationship with his brother permanently poisoned by mutual suspicion and disappointed expectations. His contemporary Miguel de Cervantes, who received no glory at Lepanto beyond a maimed hand, and the memory of having served, transformed his experiences into literature that has outlived all the victory celebrations and propaganda, creating in Don Quixote a character who embodied both the nobility of martial idealism and its fundamental disconnection from reality, a commentary on his own age that proved prophetic about the centuries to follow. The freed galley slaves who returned to Christian lands discovered that their societies had little use for men, whose years of captivity had rendered them unfit for normal occupations, and many ended up as beggars or criminals, their liberation proving less a restoration of their previous lives than an introduction to new forms of marginalization. The Ottoman soldiers and sailors who survived the battle and managed to return to Constantinople found themselves in an empire that had not been fundamentally weakened by the defeat, but that faced growing challenges from other directions, particularly in the east where conflict with Safavid Persia demanded resources and attention that might otherwise have been directed toward the Mediterranean, creating a strategic division that would influence Ottoman policy for the next century. The rapid reconstruction of the fleet demonstrated Ottoman resilience, but the loss of experienced crews proved impossible to fully remedy, for the knowledge and skill that come from years at sea cannot be replicated through training programs, however intensive, and this deficit in human capital would contribute to future Ottoman naval defeats even when material superiority seemed to favour the Sultan's forces. The corsairs of North Africa, who had contributed ships to the Ottoman fleet and who had suffered losses at Lepanto, found their positions subtly undermined by the defeat. For while they retained their ability to raid Christian shipping and coasts, the aura of Ottoman invincibility that had protected them and that had given them leverage in their relationships with Constantinople was damaged, and increasingly they operated as semi-independent agents, whose loyalty to the Sultan was contingent rather than absolute. The religious interpretation of Lepanto as a divine judgment in favour of Christianity competed with more secular analyses that emphasise material factors like superior firearms and the tactical advantages that galleasses provided, and this competition between religious and secular explanations reflected broader intellectual currents in late 16th century Europe, where the Renaissance emphasis on human agency and observable causation was beginning to challenge traditional theological frameworks without yet displacing them. Pope Pius had attributed the victory to the Virgin Mary and had established the Feast of Our Lady of Victory, later renamed the Feast of the Holy Rosary, to commemorate the battle, and this religious framing served important purposes in maintaining papal authority and in justifying the Church's involvement in military affairs, but it sat uneasily alongside the reports from commanders who emphasised tactical decisions and material advantages, creating a tension that would become more pronounced as European thought developed in the 17th century. The men who fought at Lepanto themselves likely held both interpretations simultaneously, seeing no contradiction between believing that God favoured Christian arms and recognising that their arquebuses outranged Turkish bows. For the 16th century mind had not yet fully embraced the either-or thinking that would characterise later ages. The economic consequences of Lepanto rippled through Mediterranean commerce for years afterward, disrupting trade routes and creating opportunities for merchants who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances while bankrupting those who had invested heavily in the pre-war status quo, and these economic effects probably influenced ordinary lives more directly than the battle's military or religious significance, for people must eat and trade regardless of who controls the seas or what faith they profess. The interruption of Venetian commerce with Ottoman territories created openings for English and Dutch merchants who had been gradually expanding their presence in the Mediterranean and who proved more willing to trade with Muslims when profit was available than their Catholic competitors, whose religious scruples sometimes interfered with commercial opportunity, an early example of how Protestant Europe's more pragmatic approach to economic relations would eventually give it advantages in the emerging global economy. The insurance markets that had developed in Italian cities to spread the risks of maritime commerce faced unprecedented claims after Lepanto as ships and cargoes were lost, creating a crisis that forced innovation in insurance practices and risk assessment that would influence the development of modern finance, another example of how military events generate unanticipated consequences in seemingly unrelated areas of human activity. The strategic stalemate that followed Lepanto, with neither Christian nor Ottoman powers able to achieve decisive dominance in the Mediterranean, led gradually to a de facto partition of the sea into spheres of influence that would persist until the 18th century, when new technologies and the rise of Atlantic powers would again transform the strategic balance. And this partition allowed both sides to divert resources to other conflicts that were becoming increasingly urgent: Spain to the Netherlands and later to the 30 Years' War, the Ottomans to Persia, and later to conflicts with Russia and Austria. This shift of attention away from the Mediterranean meant that the sea, which had been the centre of the known world for millennia, gradually became a strategic backwater, important for trade and for the powers that bordered it, but no longer the primary theatre where the fate of civilizations was decided, and this transition was already beginning to be visible in the years immediately following Lepanto, even if contemporaries could not yet fully recognise the pattern. The battle thus marks not only a military turning point but a broader historical transition, the moment when Mediterranean-centred history began its long decline in favour of Atlantic and eventually global frameworks, when the sea that had witnessed the rise and fall of Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans and Byzantines began to fade from the centre of human affairs. The legacy of Lepanto in military thought proved complex and sometimes contradictory, for while it demonstrated the continuing viability of galley warfare when properly executed, it also revealed the galley's limitations and accelerated interest in alternatives that would culminate in the Age of Sail, and this dual legacy meant that different observers drew opposite conclusions from the same evidence depending on their prior assumptions and institutional commitments. The naval academies and training programs that emerged in the 17th century studied Lepanto as both a model of successful naval coordination and a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities of oared vessels, using it to justify whatever lesson the instructor wanted to teach, which says more about the pedagogical uses of history than about the battle's actual significance. Military theorists who wrote about galley tactics in the decades after Lepanto generally acknowledged that the battle had proven certain principles while also revealing new vulnerabilities, but their analyses were constrained by the limited information available and by the tendency to interpret evidence in ways that confirmed existing doctrines rather than challenging them. The human cost of Lepanto, while impressive in aggregate numbers, becomes almost incomprehensible when one attempts to appreciate the individual tragedies represented by each casualty. The futures not lived, and the families destroyed, and the potential lost when 30,000 men died in a single day, and this cost raises questions about whether the battle's strategic consequences justified its human price, questions that have no clear answers but that haunt any serious consideration of military history. The mothers and fathers and wives and children who lost loved ones at Lepanto experienced the battle not as a grand clash of civilizations, but as personal catastrophe, and their grief was not diminished by whatever strategic or religious significance observers attributed to the event, reminding us that historical narratives constructed from the perspective of states and leaders inevitably obscure the human reality of the events they describe. The disabled veterans who returned from Lepanto bearing physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal found themselves in societies that honoured military service in theory, but provided little practical support for those whose injuries made them unable to work, and many ended their lives in poverty despite having participated in what was celebrated as one of the great Christian victories of the age. The question of what would have happened if the Ottomans had won at Lepanto invites speculation that serious historians usually avoid, yet it is worth considering briefly because it illuminates what was actually at stake and what was not. For while an Ottoman victory would certainly have strengthened the Sultan's position, and might have led to further Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, it is unlikely that it would have fundamentally altered the long-term trajectory of European development, which was increasingly driven by Atlantic trade and by internal dynamics like the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution that had little connection to Mediterranean power struggles. The narrative of Lepanto as the battle that saved Christian Europe from Muslim conquest is largely retrospective myth-making that serves ideological purposes but that exaggerates what was realistically at stake. For by 1571 the Ottoman Empire was approaching the limits of its expansion and facing internal challenges that would have constrained further conquests regardless of naval victories. Nevertheless, myths have their own historical importance, and the myth of Lepanto as Christian civilization's narrow escape from Islamic domination shaped European self-understanding and attitudes toward Islam in ways that persisted long after the battle's actual strategic significance had faded. The technological and tactical lessons of Lepanto were studied by naval commanders for generations, but the specific circumstances that made the battle possible, particularly the assembly of a large Christian coalition and the decision to fight in restricted waters where galleys' limitations were less pronounced, proved impossible to replicate, meaning that Lepanto remained unique rather than establishing a template for future engagements. Later naval battles in the Mediterranean generally involved smaller forces and resulted in less decisive outcomes, confirming that Lepanto was an exception rather than a new rule, and this uniqueness has contributed to the battle's legendary status while also limiting its practical influence on naval development. The officers who studied Lepanto in the century following the battle were trying to extract general principles from a specific historical moment, a task that military education has always attempted and that always involves a certain amount of forcing evidence to fit preconceived categories. As the 17th century progressed and the Mediterranean became less central to European great power competition, Lepanto's significance was increasingly interpreted through cultural and religious rather than purely military frameworks, becoming a symbol of counter-Reformation triumph and of European resistance to Islamic expansion rather than a subject of tactical analysis. And this transformation from military event to cultural symbol demonstrates how historical memory is shaped by the needs and assumptions of later generations rather than by the event itself. The annual celebrations of Lepanto in Catholic Europe gradually became less about remembering the specific battle and more about affirming a particular vision of Christian identity and civilizational superiority, incorporating the battle into larger narratives about the relationship between Christianity and Islam that had only tangential connection to what actually happened in the Gulf of Patras in October 1571. This process of mythologization has made it difficult to see the battle clearly, for we must look through layers of interpretation and appropriation to reach anything approximating historical reality. The sunset on October 7th, 1571 illuminated a scene of devastation that defied the neat categories that chroniclers would later impose, with burning ships sending columns of smoke into a sky that a few hours earlier had seemed to promise just another autumn day, with the water stained red from blood of men whose prayers to different gods had been equally unavailing against arquebus balls and arrows, with the sounds of celebration from Christian ships mixing with the groans of wounded men regardless of their religion, creating a soundscape that captured the full horror of what humans do to each other when they organize violence on an industrial scale and justify it through appeals to transcendent purposes that make the killing easier to bear psychologically if not morally.